The Bible doesn't even come close to saying that the Bible is inspired. And a lot of people just aren't aware of that kind of stuff. Whether it's in politics or in social media, trying to combat the spread of misinformation about the Bible and religion, I cannot afford myself the luxury of sitting on the sidelines anymore. What an asinine way to hurt your child's future. But to raise them to think that the rapture is going to, suddenly everybody's going to be sucked up from the earth.
Dan McClellan, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so first off, congrats on the new book. The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. And we're gonna dig into the specifics as we go on. But I thought an interesting place would be to take a bigger picture look at what the Bible is to you and sort of your own personal connection. And you write in your new book that the Bible is the single most fascinating, complex, and influential text that has ever existed. So could you make that case for me in the audience? And why do you believe that?
Well, I personally think that because the Bible has been the inspiration of so much of the way the world functions right now. It has been at the levers of power in one form or another for around 2,000 years, and has influenced geopolitics on an enormous scale, and has been behind the scenes of a lot of what's gone on between nations, within nations. And I think it has been the most influential text that has ever existed. Certainly, the Quran is a challenger in that regard. And certainly, there are some scientific texts that have changed the way we have understood the world around us and ourselves as well. But in terms of texts that continue to influence world leaders, continue to influence large segments of populations and nations around the world, I don't think the Bible really has much of a challenger in that regard. And so, in terms of its complexity, it's something that it was not written within a single generation. It's something that was written over the course of around 1,000 years by probably more than 100 different authors, and who knows how many different editors and redactors and transcribers. And so it has come together over such a long period and reflects so many different worldviews and so many different perspectives. But then we kind of engage it as a single literary product, and we collapse centuries of change, diachronic as well as synchronic change, down into treating it as if it were speaking with one single unified and consistent voice, and from one single unified and consistent perspective. And I think that's just fascinating, and I think that's complex, and because of that, it is kind of a choose your own adventure, um divine authorization. Like, it has no inherent meaning as a text, and so we read whatever meaning we find into the text. And so it can be so many different things, it can respond to so many different needs, it can be configured and negotiated with in so many different ways, that it is just that I think it's the most fascinating text that has ever existed.
Fascinating. It's fascinated me as well. And I'm curious your personal journey, when a little bit of a snapshot of how you became sort of fascinated and obsessed. How did you get to the point where you've dedicated all your energy and life basically to the study of this book?
Well, that was as an adult. I didn't really grow up with much of a religious sensibility. I think the first time I ever read the Bible was when I was just bored sitting in a pew waiting for my mom to get finished with a nativity play I think she was a part of, and I started flipping through it and thought it was weird. But when I was an adult, and I was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I became a Mormon when I was 20, and I made plans to go leave to serve a 2-year proselytizing mission a year later. And in that year, I realized I knew nothing about all of these scriptures that I was going to have to be preaching from for the next 2 years. And I decided I was going to read all of what Latter-day Saints call the standard works, the Bible, and then uniquely LDS scriptures before I left. And so I was reading an hour, hour and a half a day. And I just fell in love with the culture, the history, the language, as I was trying to get underneath the hood of what I was reading in the Old Testament and the New Testament, as well as in the Apocrypha, which I found fascinating. I just fell in love with learning more about this world behind this text and wanting to know more about it. And when I was out in Uruguay serving as a missionary, I found out, well, one, I had already been kicked out of one university, and I had a muscular 0.29 GPA. So the odds I was going to get into another university was low, but I figured a convert returned missionary, that had to hold some weight if I wanted to try to get into BYU. And I found out about a program they had there called Ancient Near Eastern Studies. And I thought if I could make a living studying the Bible, that would be about the coolest thing in the world. And it took some finagling, and it took a lot of time for me to recover from that 0.29 GPA. And BYU laughed at me the first time that I applied. But I was able to get into a program. And as I got into a graduate program and began studying this on a much deeper level, I just fell more and more in love with learning about these people, these texts, these manuscripts, this language, and just all of it. And so now I am fortunate enough to be able to do precisely what I hope to be able to do and study the Bible for a living, which I think is about the coolest thing in the world.
You know, as a scene setter for people, most people who follow your work know this. So you're practicing Mormon, and we'll talk a little bit about the church later in the interview. But I recently interviewed Francesca Stavrakopoulos, who you're friends with. She was your PhD supervisor, and a part of our conversation was, well, she's an atheist biblical scholar, and she's often dismissed. Well, you're an atheist. That means you hate God, you hate Christians. So you're clearly trying to debunk this book and make us look like idiots. You face a similar thing. Well, you're a Mormon. Why are you talking about the Bible? You can't be, you must be trying to discredit. So, what kind of opposition do you face, and how do you handle that?
Well, I face, oddly enough, I face opposition across the entire spectrum of belief and non-belief, from atheists who don't trust me, all the way to my co-religionists who live on my street who don't trust me, because I think they all perceive that I'm attacking some feature of their worldview, in one way or another. And so I think it's more of a kind of reflexive, kind of defensive mechanism to just dismiss me as either being a closet atheist who's just trying to, who hates God, who's trying to tear down the Bible. I get the same accusations thrown at me. It's not gendered like it is for Francesca, but I get a lot of the same accusations thrown at me. And then from within my religion and within broader mainstream Christianity, uh, folks don't trust me because I'm kind of chipping away at some of the foundations of their own understanding of their faith. And I recognize that a lot of what I'm doing is challenging the dogmas that construct a lot of the foundations of a lot of people's faiths. But I find many of them to be rather brittle, rather fragile, and also rather harmful. And so I'm not attacking faith in and of itself. I'm attacking certain expressions of it that I find rather harmful, and to actually actively hurt people in my community and around the world. And how I deal with it, for the most part, I ignore it. If I get the sense that somebody is engaging in good faith and is actually being thoughtful about things, I will engage for as long as is necessary. But the hate that gets spewed my way, there's an awful lot of it, but that's very easy to ignore,
Mm.
because I know where it's coming from. As a
Right.
specialist in the cognitive science of religion, I understand the motivations. I understand what they're trying to do, how they're trying to make themselves feel better, and so I don't feel the need to go out and engage anything and everything that is thrown at me. But if people are being sincere and thoughtful, I'm happy to engage for as long as it takes.
Right. It's interesting. You mentioned the cognitive thing, and I'm hoping we can unpack a little bit of that as we get through some of these specifics I want to get into the book, because as someone who grew up in the church, like, it can rattle your world for someone to try to flip something on its head. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety involved in that. So I totally get how people like you and Francesca can feel threatening. Um, so let's get into the book. So this new book, I said, the Bible says so. You're tacking into these big controversial issues, trying to bring your academic nuance and insights into a lot of Christians just definitively say this is what it says. But this debate is ancient. You've been talking about it for years and years and years. So why a book like this now? And what's sort of the relevance and urgency that you felt in 2025?
Well, for many years now, I've been seeing an awful lot of misinformation about the Bible and religion being spread on social media. Social media is a phenomenal tool for a lot of things, but one of the problems with it is that it allows misinformation and disinformation to spread around the world in an instant. And I first became really concerned with this when I was a graduate student, and things like these the Jordan-led codices. I don't know if you remember hearing about this back in 2011.
No.
A con artist claimed to have discovered 70 lead codices from the first century with Christian writing and iconography all over them, but they were modern forgeries, and that spread all around the world. And this man was able to leverage an awful lot of power and money based on this misinformation. And so I and some friends who were concerned for seeing our field misrepresented and exploited this way tried to put our heads together to come up with ways to respond to things on social media, but we weren't really making a ton of headway. And so every now and then, when I see misinformation spreading, I just can't help but try to engage it. And since 2015/2016, I think the misinformation and the Christian nationalism has been ratcheted up. And so I think it's more acute now than ever, particularly with something like TikTok, where people can get millions and millions and millions of views on these videos. I figured I might as well um, try to see what I could do to act as a bit of an umpire, just to call balls and strikes, not really play for any team, but try to represent to the best of my abilities a critical approach to what scholars are actually saying about the data related to the study of the Bible and religion. And so the book, I think, comes out of my observation that this misinformation is spreading increasingly more widely, increasingly more rapidly. More and more people are getting into the game, and uh, that Christian nationalism is becoming more and more acute as well. And so I'm just trying to do whatever I can to try to step in and combat that spread of misinformation to the degree I can. And the book is one way I'm trying to do this. I talk in the book about how quoting Captain America, I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from, whether it's inside my own faith community or from the Bible itself or elsewhere. I'm trying to combat that because I think the world is headed in a very concerning direction, and I would like to do whatever I can to use whatever influence I might have on social media to give people the tools to be able to confront and challenge this misinformation. So, and hopefully people see that as somewhat of a reference work. I'm trying to be entertaining to the degree that I'm able to be, but it's also intended to be a reference work. So when people
Right.
have questions, they can come back, they can go through the footnotes, they can look up the literature that's cited there and get much better informed about this, so that they're not swayed by every wind of Christian nationalist doctrine, because I think it's going to get a lot worse in the near future.
I want to ask you about modern times a little bit later if we have time, but I don't want to get lost in because I think we're all obsessed about what's happening today, like as we speak, but I definitely want to come back to that if we can. But one of the chapters that was one of my favorites, because it's something I think about, this idea that the Bible is divinely inspired. And I think this is a really important one because I think it's almost like the bedrock of the rest of it. If you believe or think that it's inspired, you're doing all these mental gymnastics to justify things and try to explain things. But talk a little bit about sort of 2 Timothy 3:16 is this important one, and you kind of break it down. It's so fascinating that it's God breathed, that it's God inspired. But when you start to look at specific words, it's like could be more that it's life giving, which is a radically different thing than inspired. So talk about the
Yeah.
importance of getting this one right and what people should know about what the Bible actually says about that one.
Well, that's the main proof text when it comes to the inspiration of the Bible. And, it to begin, it presupposes univocality. This is something that I talk about in the book, this notion that the Bible speaks with one single unified and consistent voice. That's a dogma that's not supported by any data at all. But in order for 2 Timothy 3:16 to apply to Genesis or Jeremiah or the Gospel of Mark, you have to just presuppose that everything in here is univocal. And then if you interpret 2 Timothy 3:16 to be talking about the Bible as we have it today, then you can say, all right, there's the proof text that establishes that every word from Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22 is all inspired, inerrant, historical, univocal. It's the word of God. And that just crumbles to pieces when you start considering all the details of what we're presupposing, because the Bible as we know it was not known to anyone who wrote anything that occurs anywhere in the Bible. The Bible as we know it came together in the centuries after the last author of any syllable of the Bible was dead and gone. And so they're not talking about the Bible as we know it. They're talking about a completely different set of scriptures. And 2 Timothy 3:16 says all scripture. And that was a much broader set of texts than what we now know as the Bible. And so right there, that's problematic. Is First Enoch inspired? The author of the Epistle of Jude certainly seems to think so, referring to it as prophecy. Our earliest Christians, Tertullian, for instance, vehemently defends the inspiration of First Enoch, but a lot of people today don't want to have anything to do with First Enoch. It's got some weird stuff in it, and it's also very self-contradictory. So that complicates things a bit. Then we get into the fact that Second Timothy is agreed by the majority of scholars to not even have been written by Paul. And everybody thinks this is Paul, and that's what grants it authority. Paul is one of these apostles from the early church who had a vision where he directly engaged with the resurrected Jesus. But Second Timothy was probably written decades after Paul was dead by someone who was pretending to be Paul. And so that undermines the assumptions, the dogmas about the authority of this text. So that's another crack in the foundation. And then we get to the word theopneustos, which means God breathed, which has traditionally been interpreted as inspired. But I talk in the book about how there's this wonderful book that was published a few years ago by a scholar named John Poirier called The Invention of the Inspired Text. And he goes through and looks at all of the occurrences that he can find of this and related words in early Christianity, and then outside of Christianity, within Judaism, within the Greco-Roman world, and finds that it always seems to mean life-giving, not inspired as we know it. The Greek word that means inspired as we think of inspired is entheos, and that is not used in 2 Timothy 3:16. And what he shows is that it's actually a theologian named Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century CE who innovates this new understanding of theopneustos as a reference to inspiration, and quotes this passage dozens of times across his many texts to argue that this is the text that indicates the scriptures are all inspired. And so when we consider all of these data, what we see is that this text does not have the authority that we want it to have. It's not referring to the text that we want it to refer to. It's not even saying what we want it to say. And so the Bible doesn't even come close to saying that the Bible is inspired. And I think that really problematizes that dogma, that assertion that this text is the linchpin that holds the whole Bible together as inspired, inerrant, historical, and univocal. And a lot of people just aren't aware of that kind of stuff. And
right.
One of the main reasons I'm writing the book is so that people who do not have a graduate level education in this, or don't spend their time arguing on the internet about this, can access these insights.
But this is a fascinating thing, because you're kind of mentioning, if I understood you correctly, there's like an individual person who starts to retranslate and interpret what that word means when it's inspired, but to the people who are writing it and living in the times that we're sort of like, idolizing and basing our lives on, didn't even see it that way. That it seems so obvious that we would want to know this, believe it, and understand it. Why do you think it seems to be so foreign to so many Christians? And is it about fear? Like we had addressed a little bit before, is it you believe something, you hold on to it, and you just ignore it? So how do you make sense of the fact that this obvious thing to do, like you do and we're doing now, is so foreign?
I think it has to do with the fact that, and this is another thing I talk about in the book, every generation's understanding of itself and their theology, their relationship to the Bible and everything like that, it is constantly being renewed, because we're constantly in ever-changing social and historical situations and circumstances. And so it has to be renewed. It has to change in order to continue to speak to us in order to continue to be relevant to those ever-changing circumstances. And but we tend to just focus on what is relevant to us, and we don't tend to worry about what has come before, what has made it relevant to the generations before us who lived in within entirely different circumstances. But when we accept it as the word of God, as the gospel, as inspired texts, inspired doctrines, inspired theology, that is a threat to that, because it shows that things have changed. And one of the foundations of a lot of this is that it doesn't change. God never changes. The Bible doesn't change. The theology doesn't change. And so to say, well, just a couple generations back, they looked at it completely differently because of different circumstances that they found themselves in. That's a challenge to that. And intuitively, we want to believe that our worldview is good. Our worldview is correct. We are good. The social identities that are important to us are good. And intuitively, there's going to be a bit of a pinch when we begin to approach the acknowledgement that, oh, there's a problem here, and we shy away from it. And what happens is a process called rationalization, because I don't think I talk about this in the book, but there's a whole spectrum of cognition, from reflective cognition, where we're aware of our thinking process, all the way to intuitive cognition. This is stuff that goes on subconsciously that we're not aware of. And this governs how we think, see, feel, everything, the world around us, our own thoughts and emotions and things like that. And none of the reflective cognition is coming. Let me put that another way. Our intuitive cognition is rifling through all of the mail that our reflective cognition gets. And so if it doesn't like the way something is going to make us feel, it's going to nudge us in the direction of interpreting it in a different way. And one of the things one example I use when I talk about this is, if I see a tweet from Donald Trump, I'm already primed to be like, what did this idiot say now? Like, I'm already going to disagree no matter what. And if it's something that's reasonable, it's going to throw me for a loop. I'm going to be like, all right, hang on a minute, I got to think about this. Whereas if I see a tweet or an email from a good friend of mine, I might be primed to already agree with what's going on. And that's stuff that's going on intuitively. And so intuitively, we're going to perceive that recognizing problems with 2 Timothy 3:16 represents a threat to our worldview. And so we're going to feel like that's bad. We're going to feel that intuitive pinch, and then we're immediately going to set to work trying to rationalize or justify that feeling. We're going to say, okay, well, this guy's a Mormon, so obviously, we can just dismiss everything. Or this guy's a closet atheist, so obviously we can just dismiss everything. And so intuitively, somebody put it a good way. We're not thinking creatures that have feelings. We're feeling creatures that think. And the idea is that our rationalizations are mainly trying to make us feel good about our feelings. And so I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people don't like this. Now, the folks who have already kind of crossed the Rubicon, who are already questioning what's going on, who have already confronted the pushback they get from family and relatives and their religious community from questioning, they're the ones who are going to feel validated by this kind of stuff. They're the ones who are going to say, ooh, I want more, I want to know more, because that is validating that intuitive worldview as well. I think we are primed to accept stuff that validates our worldview, and we're primed to challenge stuff and disagree with stuff that we feel threatens our worldview, which is why you have a lot of people just kind of staying in their cognitive rut and saying, no, I'm going to continue to do what I've always been doing.
I think something that's always bothered me, and I don't know if you have any reflections on this, in the sense that everything is evolving around us. So like we should be evolving our ideas, we should be expanding. And when we become stale, like that isn't the pattern of life and reality. And it's a shame that some people don't see that with God. Like there are people, for example, I'm a big fan of Richard Rohr. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. And he was quite influential on some of my thinking, where it's like once you sort of see or feel like radical love and have a certain level of empathy, you can go back to the Bible, and it's obviously what has some sort of inspiration. And to your point, is life-giving. If I read a verse and it is life-giving, that would, to me, as my best days when I'm a believer, be like, this is good. I can take this. When I'm reading something negative and nasty, and whether it's something about slavery, whether it's something that seems quasi-racist today, it's so obvious that this would have nothing to do with the source of life. And I just think it's such a shame that people can't see the text like that. I wonder if it's something as clearly an empathetic person who just sees as like, there's just such a better way to look into this.
You bring up empathy, which is interesting because within the cognitive science of religion, empathy is one of the things that facilitates pro-sociality, facilitates actually human civilization because it contributes to cooperation. And it is also one of the things that is more closely correlated to religious belief. And so I think empathy is one of the cornerstones of human civilization as well as religion. But that's on an individual level. But religion also functions on a social level where it becomes this social framework that facilitates cooperation and pro-sociality and things like that, but allows institutions to kind of arrogate power and curate how pro-sociality is going to function, and that brings power into the question, and that tends to corrupt, that tends to lead to abuses of power where the interests of the institutions take priority over the interests of the individuals. And empathy kind of gets shoved aside an awful lot. And I think that's what we're seeing with Christian nationalism is too many people who are not on the empathetic side of the equation, but are more on the thirst for power side of the equation, recognizing the value of being at the levers of religious power. And that's where I think religion can be the most harmful, but that's where folks who are oriented toward a more empathetic worldview and cognitive architecture, I think, have an advantage. And hopefully, they allow empathy to be their guiding light rather than this naked thirst for power that we see. And these arguments that Bishop Buddy advocating for mercy for the vulnerable who are scared right now to the president of the United States was just demonized vehemently by folks who talked about the sin of empathy and talked about weaponized empathy. And I think that's just a wonderful illustration of the perversion of what I think the people who were responsible for writing the New Testament and many parts of the Hebrew Bible were really trying to prioritize, particularly the prophetic parts of the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. And so, yeah, I think empathy is a big part of this.
Right.
And it's a shame that people who want power are trying to shove empathy down and make it sound like a liability or a weakness.
Absolutely. I think that's so interesting and so key. And it's interesting when we talk about empathy, I feel like one issue that you care a lot about and you write about in this new book is about homosexuality, and you talk about the LGBTQ plus community and all that. And of course, these are important things to talk about because the Bible is used to so demonize and hurt a lot of these vulnerable groups, especially in that category. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, as and to tee you up, is like the idea of sexual orientation identity didn't exist back then. And so a little bit of a primer on what the Bible actually says about same-sex relationships and why you personally think it's important for you to tackle this issue in the new book.
Yeah, a lot of folks think that my argument is that the Bible does not condemn homosexuality. And I kind of say there's a sense in which it does, there's a sense in which it doesn't. And I distinguish those two senses because I think it's important that we be accurate about this and we actually drill down to the bedrock of what it is the Bible is saying, because I think too many people are able to leverage the Bible because they dilute the waters and they make it into something that it's not. Because homosexuality can be used, primarily it's used to refer to a sexual orientation. There are folks who are oriented to sexual attraction to members of the same sex. And this is obviously a spectrum. You have heterosexuality, bisexuality, homosexuality, and a variety of other sexual orientations. But this is something that we've only come to understand scientifically since the 19th century. And in the ancient world, they didn't think about it this way. Um, Sex was not an activity that two uh, equal and consenting partners engaged mutually in. Sex was something that an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object, and the consent and the agency of that sexual object was irrelevant. It was only the sexual agent who was acting as a sexual agent, and sexual agency flowed downstream on this socially conventionalized hierarchy of domination. And so this is why we see in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 a whole litany of inappropriate sexual partners. Almost every single one is a prohibition on a sexual partner that a man chooses. There's only one example of a prohibition on a sexual partner that a woman chooses, and that is when that partner is an animal, because that's the only sexual partner that a woman could choose that would be lower than her on that socialized hierarchy of domination. Because if a woman has sex with a man, she's not acting on the man, she's being acted upon. And so, in that, to put a man in the position of the receptive partner in an active male same sex intercourse is to debase him and subjugate him sexually, to feminize him socially. And that violates that hierarchy. And so that is considered inappropriate. But the passages don't tell the receptive partner, hey, don't take the receptive role. The passage prohibits the insertive partner from taking the insertive role because he is the acting sexual agent. And they didn't understand this in terms of, oh, I have a homosexual orientation, I'm only attracted to members of my own biological sex. They kind of had a way to rationalize why a man might want to sexually penetrate any other given body. If you're running around with a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, is kind of how they rationalize this. But they couldn't rationalize why a man would seek out the receptive role. So, in other words, they could make sense of tops, they couldn't really make sense of bottoms. And the notion of a versatile role, somebody who went back and forth, was just did not compute at all. So they rationalized one. They treated the other as either a pathology. This is the feminizing disease, as Philo says, or they were a victim of sexual assault. That's what's going on. And so this is not to say that they would have said, oh, well, they love each other, so then it's okay. I'm not saying the authors of Leviticus would have been cool with that, and they're only talking about sexual assault, or they're only talking about cultic prostitution or something like that. I've seen folks make that argument. That's not the argument I'm making. I don't think they would have been very accepting of long-term monogamous, loving, equal same-sex partnerships, because that would not have computed. I don't think they had any concept of such a thing in the ancient world.
Right.
And so I don't think that what we see in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 is transferable to today. I don't think you can just say, okay, what they said there, that applies to today, because they're operating with an entirely different worldview, an entirely different understanding of human sexuality. Their reasoning behind why it's bad is that it's going to generate this metaphysical contamination that's going to get out on the land and pollute the land, and then the land is going to have to vomit them out if it reaches a critical mass. Like, all of that is so wildly outdated and irrelevant to today that you've got to do an awful lot of work to try to retrofit Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, as well as Romans 1 and First Corinthians and these others, to today. And so one of the points I make in the book is that the majority of the sexual ethic of the Bible we've already rejected. When it comes to polygamy, when it comes to sex slavery, when it comes to slavery in general, when it comes to women as sexual objects, as commodities to be bought and sold, we've already, when it comes to Paul's advocacy for celibacy, we've overwhelmingly rejected the rest of the Bible's sexual ethic. Why maintain this phenomenally harmful and outdated sexual ethic? And what I argue is that this is because it functions as a handy identity marker. It's a piece of costly signaling. It's a way to put on display to others around you that you're willing to incur social costs in order to show others that you will toe the line and that you will defend the group's mores. And when principles become costly signaling and credibility enhancing displays and identity markers, their function pivots. It's no longer because this is a principle that is defensible or is good in and of itself. It's now useful as an identity marker, and we leave behind its legitimacy so that it can function as an identity marker. And that's how it's functioning today. And I think it will continue to function as an identity marker for conservative readers of the Bible until enough people realize that the livelihoods and the very lives of men, women, and children all around the world are worth more than the value of this thing as a piece of costly signaling. It's just a matter of time before the pendulum swings the other way. This is what happened with slavery in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. We just flatly rejected what the Bible had to say about it. And we had to come around to thinking about a new way to understand the Bible to maintain its authority while also saying, no, we actually don't like that anymore. The same thing will happen with the LGBTQ plus issue. It's just a matter of how long it takes people to grow the hell up and realize that this is just an identity marker. This is not any deeper or more important than that.
I'm so glad you're optimistic about that. I'll take your optimism and I'll move on with it. I'm curious from I've had my own experience. Obviously I grew up I've seen a rapid evolution and change in the thinking in my life, right? It's like I grew up, of course, homosexuality was a sin, gay people were evil. Like that's me as a kid to a point of like radical love and radical change on my thinking. Did you grow up rather bigoted in some areas? Because you seem quite progressive. What's your own experience like with that?
I was raised in a very, very conservative household in my early youth, but things changed as I got older. When I was in high school, I think my parents and my brothers and sisters, we were kind of getting to know a new and a different world, and we have all since left behind the conservatism of youth. But yeah, I grew up using homophobic slurs when I was knowing them and being like, oh, I'm cool if I use these things in like elementary school and into high school. And I actually remember I was waiting tables at a restaurant, and I used a slur, just joking with another employee, not knowing that that he was a member of the LGBTQ plus community. But he just kind of frankly said, hey, you don't have to use that language to be funny or cool, and then walked away. And I felt called out, and I felt that intuitive pinch, and I was kind of like, hey, I'm just being funny. But I sat with it, and I realized this is harmful. This is something that I would not appreciate people using slurs like that to as a joke if it was something that I identified with. And I went back and I said, you know what? You made me think about this. I apologize. I was wrong. I'm never going to use any of these slurs ever again. And it was hard. It was not an easy pivot to make in my worldview, because I had a whole past, a whole background, a whole upbringing that I was in a lot of ways proud of. And people, it's about heritage, not hate, is kind of the same thing. They just want to preserve their feeling that they come from a good place, and I wanted to do the same. But I realized that that was just prioritizing my own needs over and against my relationship with other people that I needed to be around every day. And slowly over time, I began to see similar things happen with other aspects of my relationships with women, and with for instance immigrants and people who spoke other languages and things like this. And so in my late teens, early 20s, I really pivoted entirely away from a lot of the features of my upbringing. And particularly when I went and spent 2 years in Uruguay in South America, having to learn another language, being an outsider in another nation, and not nearly to the degree that a lot of folks experience in the United States, but experiencing, um, the short end of systemic power and recognizing what it's like to experience that. Came home to the United States with an entirely different worldview, and that. And then later got into arguing about religion on the internet, and then got into politics after that. And so yeah, I think what radicalized me is just taking seriously the feelings of others, and then actually getting to a small taste of what it's like to be underprivileged in a world where I was not a part of the ruling class, and then coming back to the United States and being like, "Holy crap! It's all going on here too. I'm just one of the ones who benefits from it." And they're having kids, getting married. A lot of these other things helped me kind of let my empathy be in the driver's seat for a little while, instead of just letting my intuitions about
Yeah.
my privileges and all that kind of stuff. Just normally I just ride roughshod over all of that, but I had to stop and think hard about a lot of things when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and completely changed
Yeah.
things for me.
I think it's so interesting because you wrote in the book, and I wrote this down. You said, when all other things are equal, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to the less powerful group. And I find some of my radical transformation and growing empathy has been about looking to the margins of society and starting to understand them and meet people in those spaces and talk to people in those spaces. And I find that from a spiritual sense, my conception of what God could be, the expansion of the love and feeling myself change in a deeper way without necessarily getting, if you don't want to get into your own personal thing, but it seems to be such a better way to start to become a more loving person. Why do you feel like, why give the benefit of the doubt to the powerful people? How does it change you?
How does it change me? I think it allows the empathy to be in the driver's seat, which, as I said earlier, is one of the cornerstones of human civilization. And seeing things from the other side, and coming back to my own society where I was a member of the ruling class, and saying, no, I'm going to set this aside, and I'm going to take seriously the voices of these folks who live, experience the world in a way that I would consider a nightmare. To like and there was one event that was from about 7 or 8 years ago. I forget exactly how long. My oldest daughter came up to me and she said, "Dad, what sports are girls allowed to play?" And that broke me, because I that was not a thought that could have ever entered my head when I was growing up. Nothing was in my way. Nothing. I was not prevented from playing anything or doing anything. It was all available to me. And my daughter had not only recognized that not all things were available to her, she seemed reconciled to it and just wanted to know where the boundaries of her agency were. And that destroyed me. And I realized she's growing up in a world that I have never experienced and will never and can never experience. And it's a world that I would consider a nightmare. But this is my daughter, my member of my own household, who is experiencing that world as a child. And I just realize I'm doing this all wrong. I cannot tolerate bringing up children in a world that I would consider a nightmare to grow up in. And so yeah, the more I try to take seriously and give the benefit of the doubt to the less powerful groups, the more I see those systemic power asymmetries, and the more horrified I am that I have contributed to those systems of power, and I benefit from them and just ignore the fact that they turn other people's experience of the world into a nightmare. Like right now, I can imagine what a trans woman must be going through living in 2025 United States of America. It must be a nightmare. It's not something that I could tolerate. And so, yeah, that's, I think I can no longer grant myself the luxury of ignoring those things. And so even in my scholarship, I try to advocate for data over dogma, and not playing for any team but trying to call balls and strikes. But when it comes to needing a tiebreaker, um, the less powerful group is always going to get the benefit of the doubt from me,
Yeah.
because just siding with the more powerful group not only causes harm, but I have no interest in further privileging folks who have experienced nothing but privilege throughout their entire lives. And I would like to see us
Yeah.
feel a little less comfortable with our place in the
Totally.
United States.
It's funny too, just like it's a very Christ-like worldview, right? Like that sounds like what how Jesus, that's how the Bible really teaches. So it's interesting. As much as I might be a critic of the Bible and stuff like that, I can see the logic in the Jesus narrative and the Jesus story, and why it continues to inspire people who are still critical, because living like that is so necessary even today, when the power structures, like we have the Emperor Donald Trump, right? So going back to that idea of like wrestling with that stuff, your a central part of your identity is your willingness to sort of go into the fight and debate people online and challenge people online. I'm just curious, because it's difficult, it's draining. Why do you choose to fight? So many people, I think, would pull away from that. Why do you do it?
I think there's a degree to which it's a rush for me, that I actually enjoy it. Now there's also a degree to which, only up to a point. There comes a point when it becomes stressful, when it can cause, depressive episodes and things like that. So, but I've spent long enough doing it that I recognize the boundaries of my ability to engage competently and willfully in these fights. And so I have, and that's part of the reason that I set up the boundaries I do for my social media content, particularly related to my own faith, because I know that's not a winning battle to go argue with other people about my faith. That's not what I'm here to do. So that's out of bounds. But I also think that it's incumbent upon me, as someone who has lived such a privileged life, to leverage those privileges, and that includes my graduate education, my expertise in this, to go into the fray where others may not, or where others may not have the access to the power or resources to be able to do so. I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. That's what I decided after I had that conversation with my daughter. That's why I got involved in, this was 2015 or 2016. That's why I got involved in politics and ran for my state legislature uh, two different times, was because I wasn't going to be on the sidelines. I might not win every battle, but I'm going to be in the battle, whether it's in politics or in social media, trying to combat the spread of misinformation about the Bible and religion. I cannot afford myself the luxury of sitting on the sidelines anymore.
Mm.
There's too much at stake for me and for the people I love.
You mentioned depressive episodes. Are you saying that sometimes the work you're doing, the work we see you doing online, has led you into some pretty dark times? And why?
Um,
How does that play out for you?
Not really over the last couple of years, because I have developed a more keen awareness of the boundaries of what I can deal with, which is why these days, if someone's not engaging in good faith, I am happy to block them. I don't care. I'm not here just to, I'm not obligated to continuously engage someone who's not engaging in good faith because they're clout chasing or because they get a rush from it. But yeah, in the past, it has resulted in depressive episodes, feelings of inadequacy. There's an awful lot of imposter syndrome. There's a sense that this will never be good enough. I can never win. These are all losing battles. That kind of stuff has come up in the past, and I don't experience depressive episodes to near the degree of seriousness that a lot of people I know and love do. So I don't want to minimize things, and act like somehow I've overcome depression, and everybody else is isn't able to do that. I don't experience it as nearly as seriously as a lot of people do, but it has happened in the past where it has felt like I'm tilting at social windmills, where these things are never going to change, and everything I could possibly do is not going to be enough. But over the last 3 years or so, I've seen a response that makes me feel like, um, this is something that's valuable to an awful lot of people. I get comments every single day and messages from people who tell me I'm making a difference in their life. I have even, there are folks who have even said that I have changed their life as a result of the access that I've given them to this information and to these ways of thinking about the Bible and religion. And so, even though I may not win all the battles when it comes to combating the spread of misinformation, in fact, I may never win any battles, it's still, there are still wins here and there. There are still a lot of ways that it's making a difference for a lot of people. And that is phenomenally validating. And so I would say over the last 2 or 3 years, I don't think I've really experienced any depressive episodes. I've gotten stressed out because I now do
Yeah.
this. I do this full time now. This is my living, and that has its own stressors associated with it. But yeah, the depressive episodes, I don't think I've experienced one related to combating the spread of misinformation about the Bible online in a few years now.
I can relate roughly to when you deplete yourself by really going in with this passion and this knowledge, and you're in front of someone, you're just envisioning them hearing you and their hearts changing, and it'll make sense. It'll make them a better loving person. And it's just like a stone wall, and you can just go on these weeks of like, what am I doing this for? Like, do I even believe this? So I totally get it. One other part that an interesting area I wanted to sort of discuss with you a little bit is, the Bible says God lies. You talk about this idea, like the idea that God could be a liar would sort of get rid of the whole foundations of God as this perfect, all knowing, whatever being, can't sin being. And you talk about like in Genesis, when Adam's told, if you eat the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll die. And, the story says he did and he didn't. And you're sort of wrestling with this. And I wonder too, just taking a step back from that, like, to me, the Garden of Eden is just obviously symbolism and a metaphor. And even for the people back then, was probably a story that was told in that sense. And obviously, correct me if I'm wrong. But do you find too, we're sort of wrestling with things like that when really we should be just trying to make people understand that it's a myth? So let's understand. You know what I'm trying to say? I
Yeah,
think you know what I'm trying to say. But what do you think about
yeah.
that?
I think that's absolutely true. In fact, one of the there was a Christian theologian named Christopher Stendhal who used to talk about something he calls holy envy, where he envied other religious traditions that did things or believed things that he really liked. And one of the ways I have holy envy for Judaism is in their perspective. The scriptures are not a rule book or a constitution; they're an invitation to wrestle. And so the idea is not the text itself is some inviolable, hard red line, but it's an opportunity for you to wrestle with these things. And so maybe it tells a story where God's lying. And it's not saying God's a liar. It's just saying, hey, here's a story. What are you going to do with it? It's an invitation to wrestle with that. And so I think the more people can approach the Bible that way, I think the more they can stop just acting as pawns in this game of defending the inerrancy of the Bible. Prove it's true is all you're ever going to be doing if you're trying to hold up the Bible as the inerrant, infallible, univocal, and historical Word of God, the way that a lot of evangelical and other conservative Christians today do. And so I think that makes for a boring approach to the Bible. I mean, as an invitation to wrestle, let's say Genesis does have God lying to Adam, knowingly saying, I'm gonna get him here. I'm gonna threaten him with something I'm not gonna do to just to fill him with the fear of God, and it doesn't work. So what can we learn from that? Why would the authors do that? What does that say about their understanding of God? What does that say about how we should be understanding, applying this text? I mean, that opens the door to so much more exploration, so much more learning, so much more growth, instead of just constantly limiting ourselves to this tiny little square of prove it's true. And um and so yeah, I think that's the main thing I think about when I think about what are we going to do with a passage that might be talking about God this way. And we can go back to the earliest Christians. Origen of Alexandria, I mentioned him as the 3rd century theologian who innovated the idea of theopneustos as inspiration. Origen was also the innovator of a 4-tiered hermeneutic, approach to the Bible. And the kind of historical plain sense of the text was considered the most basic and rudimentary and useless reading. And he had
Right.
other, the anagogic sense and the moral sense and all this kind of stuff. And so he would take passages like Psalm 137:9. Blessed are the ones who smash your babies against the rock. This kind of this revenge fantasy that we have against the Babylonians in Psalm 137:9. And he would say, well, hang on a minute. The babies are our sinful desires that are born in our mind, and we have to take them and we have to smash them against the rock and destroy those sinful desires. And so the competent, the intelligent, the good Christians understand that this is not saying it's good to kill babies. They understand this is saying you have to destroy your sinful desires while they are still babies so that they do not grow up and take over control of you. And so that's an example of a very similar kind of, let's not take this on the surface. Let's try to figure out what we should be understanding about this. And that's a negotiation with the text. I mean, Psalm 137:9, the author was not thinking about sinful desires. The author was thinking about revenge against the Babylonians. But that's a type of renegotiation that I think can lead to um, a more fruitful, a more productive engagement with the Bible, and a more moral approach to these kinds of things. Now, I would say you should be aware of the historical sense. You should know that this is an author who was fantasizing about revenge and said some disgusting things, but that's another example of an ancient, for a long time, authoritative hermeneutical approach to the Bible that these days folks who are just so concerned with proving it's true all the time miss out on, because they're in that tiny little box that they have drawn around themselves that they're not allowed to depart from.
That anti-intellectualism, which in a couple of examples from the book, and then I want to talk about modern times with you real quick. The anti-intellectualism that we see is so frustrating when it's so much more fruitful and life-giving and challenging. And it's sad. I know you're sad about it too, but I'm genuinely sad about that because it's enlivened my life in such remarkable ways. One of the most damaging things I think of the Bible, modern day interpretations of the Bible, is the idea of eternal hell, a place of punishment that would last forever. I am somebody who grew up until maybe 20s believing that. I feel like I've worked deeply through the trauma of that. I used to have nightmares. I used to have full-on panic attacks as a kid. If all of a sudden I couldn't find out where my parents were, I just assumed I was going to hell forever. Um, so for people who might be watching or listening who are still sort of caught up in that, tell us a little bit about what you would say the consensus view is on what the Bible actually says about hell and where this idea of eternal hell comes from and if it's worth much salt.
It comes from the Book of Enoch and Greco-Roman period Judaism, where I think we don't have any concept of hell related to what we know as hell anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, after you died, everybody, good, bad, indifferent, everything in between, went to Sheol, which was a murky, not well-defined existence that nobody looked forward to, but it was not a place where you were either given divine reward or divine punishment. You just went there like everybody else. And in the Persian post-exilic period into the Greco-Roman period, you have wisdom literature where people are contemplating the problem of evil and things like that. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? And one of the things that comes out of I refer to First Enoch as fan fiction about Genesis, and particularly Genesis 6, the story of the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, having children with human women. And this gets blown up into this, the fallen angels come down and they teach wickedness and evil to humanity and have the children who become the giants, and then their children are the Nephilim, and then their corpses have the demons that inhabit the earth rising from them. But one of the things that First Enoch does is kind of come up with a way to account for why good people who suffer throughout their lives and die without ever seeing divine justice, where that justice is, and why bad people who have good things happen to them throughout their lives and seem to die without ever facing God's justice, where God's justice is delivered. It must all happen in the afterlife. That's where we're going to find the accounts squared. And so in Enoch, you have a tour of the afterlife, the underworld, and you get to see the wicked angels. They're punished in a variety of ways. And then there are also places where the people who are good, the people who are bad, are sifted into different groups, and they are awaiting judgment and then some kind of punishment. So the idea of hell as postmortem divine punishment probably originates with First Enoch, which is kind of merging some of these Jewish scriptures with Greco-Roman ideas about the afterlife, about Hades and Tartarus and Elysium and all these kinds of things. And it's merging it all together. But you have three different main ideas. One idea of postmortem divine punishment is annihilationism, that the wicked just cease to exist. Another idea is temporary conscious torment followed by either annihilation or salvation, depending on the tradition. For some folks, you are punished and then you just cease to exist. For other folks, you're punished in order to purify you, and then you can go on to salvation. And then the other idea is eternal conscious torment. And scholars have argued that all three of these can be detected in different parts of the New Testament. So the New Testament doesn't have a consistent approach to hell, but it's using words like Gehenna and Hades and once Tartarus in ways that more or less kind of approximate what we understand as hell, but we still have these three different ideas. And it's not until after the New Testament, when we have a church hierarchy and we have a set of scriptures, and now we need to kind of harmonize everything and reconcile everything and generate a single idea about what God's postmortem divine punishment is going to look like, that we kind of settle on the eternal conscious torment part of it. And partly because that's a very, very powerful motivator and incentive for obedience. And part of it has to do with the fact that you talked about growing up with this idea. This is something that I think is a big problem within conservative Christianity, is a lot of the ideas that we teach our kids, we teach them because they're easy to understand, they're black and white, and they're effective. But then we don't let them grow out of it. We actually carry on that black and whiteness and that reductiveness and that and we carry that on through adulthood, and they're phenomenally harmful and nonsensical ideas. But I think too many people are conditioned to think that you're not supposed to grow out of that. But I think those things need to be grown out of. Otherwise, they result in all kinds of mental health issues.
Oh man,
and trauma and psychological damage and anxiety and all that kind of stuff that can exist all the way throughout somebody's adult life. And that's just, what an asinine way to hurt your child's future. But to raise them to think that the rapture is going to suddenly everybody's going to be sucked up from the earth. And if you're left behind, then, you're about to have a very rough time. Like that's just, I think that is so asinine.
But and it's, I think, whether or not just the fact that there was such a debate about that, and that some sort of like you talk this whole harmonizing thing for a particular purpose to keep people in line, like it just makes sense that if there is a God, it's got to be a loving God as far as I'm concerned, or that's my hope and my faith. Why would he create something so stupid like eternal hell? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. But there are individuals who have helped shape that, and you can see the power and the control, which you talk a lot about in the new book, the way that power, dominance sort of harmonizes these views. But just really quickly, the idea of eternal, though, I've read too that Jewish people didn't even have a word for that. So even back then, would they have even had a concept of eternity?
Well, no, within more philosophically informed Jewish and Christian communities, I think the idea of philosophical eternity was something that was current in that time period. And so you had some people, I think, who were aware of something like that. But for the most part, people would have thought of it as just time beyond the scope of our understanding or vision or ability
Okay.
to perceive. I mean, when you go into the Hebrew Bible, that's the idea. Olam doesn't mean philosophical eternity. It just means out of sight, until, as far as we can imagine and further.
Mm.
And so it just means beyond the scope of our ability to see.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's not philosophical eternity throughout most of the Bible, but I think once we get into Greek speaking and philosophically informed Greek speaking Christian communities, yeah, I think they do have an understanding of something like philosophical eternity.
Okay, interesting. A segue talking about hell, talking about modern days. A lot of people feel like we're in hell right now, and the United States is headed in this hellish direction with a hellish man at the helm. What is your current concern about Christian nationalism in the United States? Trump is back in office on the back of a lot of evangelicals. What is your current worry? How big of a threat do you think you're currently experiencing right now?
I am monumentally worried about things because last time around, luckily, as much damage as Trump did, and particularly in fumbling the response to the COVID pandemic, which resulted in over 1 million American lives lost. But luckily, he was not only was he incompetent, but he surrounded himself with people who didn't really have the malice to carry out his incompetency, his goals, and he had people who stood up against him and said, "No, this is a violation of everything that this country stands for." So there were principled people in his administration. This time around, I think he learned his lesson, and I think he's filling his administration with people equally as malicious as he is, who are not going to have an attack of conscience all of a sudden, like folks like Mike Pence did. And so I think that worries me an awful lot. The fact that so many end times Christians imagine that this is the end, that he's going to catalyze the second coming by turning Gaza into a freaking resort community. Like, how ghoulish a fantasy about a genocide fantasy. Um, and yeah, I see an awful lot of people in the United States who are conservative Christians, particularly white conservative Christians, who have perceived that pluralism is a threat to their power. There's a saying that when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I think an awful lot of people feel like white people are being oppressed right now because they're losing ground and there's more parity that is being achieved. Not total parity, but it's moving in that direction, and that feels like a threat to them. And I think Christian nationalism is being perceived as the salvation of the folks who were threatened by equality, and now no, we're going to be in charge after all, and that horrifies me because once you dehumanize folks in the interests of your own access to power, there's no limit to what you are able to do in order to maintain that power. And this is the slow scope creep that resulted in the Holocaust. They dehumanized people because they were able to perceive them as a threat to their power and their existence, and that had horrific consequences. And I don't
Mm.
think people understand that we're moving in much the same direction. It's not as overt, it's not as explicit, but that's because the people who are doing this have learned their lesson from the last time and are making it a lot more furtive, a lot more covert, and I think a lot more dangerous. So I think it's a huge threat right now, Christian nationalism. There are those who see it imploding before it's able to achieve any of its main goals. I don't know if I'm as optimistic about that.
On Donald Trump, and then a couple wrap up quick questions for you, if you don't mind. Do you think Christians, we talk about anti-intellectualism, do you think people buy the idea that he loves Christians and he is a Christian? Or do you think it's more that King Cyrus argument of like, let's use this useful idiot for our Christian aims? How are you seeing it? You're on the ground, presumably talking to these people. You get it more than the average person. Like, are they falling for it, or are they just like working with them?
Oh, I think there are plenty of Christians who are falling for it, and I've argued with many of them who make excuse after excuse after excuse for him. I don't think I think he probably understands himself to be a Christian, but I think he's got a phenomenally perverse understanding of what it means to be a Christian, and feels like whatever his intuitions are, they are correct and they are aligned with God, and so he cannot go wrong. And unfortunately, too many people are convinced of the same and are not even going to begin to think critically about his relationship to what it means to be Christian, but also what it means to be Christian is changing, and they are changing it. And there's a wonderful book by David Congdon called I've misplaced it. Yeah, I've misplaced it. Who are real Christians, or who is a real Christian? Where he talks an awful lot about Christian nationalism and how it is redefining what it means to be Christian, and how the establishing strict boundaries on Christianity is an important part of the agenda of Christian nationalism. So a lot of that is changing. I think too many people
Yeah.
take it seriously.
Yeah. Just quickly on Mormonism, you mentioned in the book, like people attack you being like, you're a Mormon, you're trying to discredit the Bible. But it's interesting, you write in your book about how, I largely represent the academic consensus, which involves textual and historical arguments that undermine Latter-day Saints' positions on scripture. So talk a little bit for those who would say, well, you would never criticize the Book of Mormon. How do you reconcile maybe some of the academic stuff that you know about another book that perhaps you read and love, versus how do you reconcile that, and what is some of the differences that you have with it?
Well, I read and love both the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and I have criticized the Book of Mormon. I've consistently, since I got on TikTok, have pointed out that the data don't support an ancient origin for the Book of Mormon or its inspiration or supernatural origins. That the data point in the direction of somebody in early 19th century America articulating the text that we now know as the Book of Mormon. And I've criticized other features of Mormonism's history and Mormonism's ideologies. And a lot of what people comment I get a lot is your Mormon is showing, and it's usually on videos where I talk either about God's wife or Jesus not being the Adonai of the Old Testament or something like that. And then they say, oh, your Mormon is showing. And I have to point out, as I do in the book, it's official Mormon doctrine that Jesus is the Jehovah of the Old Testament. And the position that I take, and the scholarly position that I take, is that Jesus is not the Jehovah of the Old Testament. So my position that they think is Mormonism is flatly and directly contradicting official Mormon doctrine, and all it shows is that they're not actually thinking very hard about what I'm saying. They're certainly not thinking very hard about Mormonism. They're just seeing something on the surface and jumping at it because intuitively they see that as a point to win, and so they're going to win that point even if it is a wrong point. So I do try to engage Mormonism and the Book of Mormon on the same terms that I engage the Bible and Christianity. It's just not my academic specialization, so it's not the focus of my channel. I'm going to spend far less time doing that than I'm going to do other things. And also, I don't think it's as interesting to the majority of my audience. Like, I have over 1 million followers just between TikTok and YouTube, and the majority of them are not Latter-day Saints. And I'm trying to make stuff that is going to be of interest to my audience, and so I'm going to engage the Bible far more than I'm going to engage the Book of Mormon. And people complain about that, but
Right.
people are going to complain about what I do no matter how I engage
Yeah.
Mormonism or Christianity or whatever. There are always going to be haters.
Just as a quick follow-up on that, like through your work and that of Francesca's, it's like I can like the Bible and be like, Moses probably didn't exist. Jesus probably did, but maybe it's more of a metaphor. And I've kind of become okay with that. When it comes to the Book of Mormon, is it kind of like you might be like, none of this stuff might have happened, but it's the lessons I've learned that help me in the modern day? Or is it not quite the same? Being like, it doesn't matter if this happened. Maybe a lot of it didn't happen, but I still love the morality or whatever.
As a scholar talking about um, the Bible and religion on social media, I would say, yeah, there are an awful lot of Latter-day Saints who approach it that way. And I think that's fine. There are an awful lot of people who approach it thinking it is history, and I think that's fine. I and this is one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about me. I'm not here to attack anyone's personal faith. I'm just criticizing the way people represent it in public and the way they try to convince other people of their positions in public. Whatever goes on in private that is not on social media, have at it. As long as you're not hurting anybody, go nuts. And so I think those are certainly appropriate approaches to the historicity of the Book of Mormon. There are a lot of folks who think that it should be required to acknowledge that the Book of Mormon is historical in order to be an upstanding member of the church. And there are other folks who think it should not be required to acknowledge the historicity of the Book of Mormon to be a member in good standing. And I can understand where both of them are coming from.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's not what I'm on social media to do.
Fair. Last question. So it feels like the Bible seems to be as popular as ever. Like you have such a huge following talking about the Bible. I interviewed Francesca Stavrakopoulos. It's by far the like 100 and some thousand people have watched that, and there's commenting all the time. There's such a rabid thing. And then you look at sort of this renaissance, there's this balance. Like a guy like Jordan Peterson has this huge audience, and he talks about the Bible and does all this stuff with like Dennis Prager, and few weeks ago or whatever it was, Wes Huff was on Joe Rogan, and everyone's talking about the Bible again on these mainstream platforms. Do you think the Bible is having a bit of a renaissance right now? And are you comfortable with the hands that it's in the intellectual spaces? How do you see the intellectual hands that it's in?
I wouldn't call someone like Joe Rogan or even Jordan Peterson occupying intellectual spaces. I think they're occupying popular spaces, but I would challenge the intellectualism of their rhetoric. I think absolutely the Bible is experiencing a renaissance. I mentioned that I think a lot of white Christians have felt under threat by pluralism. And I think this is one of the reasons that folks like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Dennis Prager are making so much money, is because they're trying to speak to that group and make them feel validated and make them feel important. And I really do think it's because they understand that they can make a lot of money off of that group. That's not to say they're not sincere, but I think they know what side of their bread is buttered. And so I see the Bible as experiencing a bit of a renaissance because it is an identity marker and because it is useful for white Christians who have felt under threat to try to regain some of that access to power and resources, which I think is not an incredibly helpful move. But then also, I do think there are folks out there. I'm just one of many folks who is trying to combat the spread of misinformation and try to help people understand the Bible on a more critical and a more accurate level. And so I think part of that renaissance is also from the folks who are pushing back and who are advocating for a more critical approach. And so I think there are two sides of it. I think they're both generating more interest in the Bible. I would like to see the side that I am on gain quite a bit more ground, because I think it is, one, the more intellectual side, the more defensible side, and the less harmful side. But two, yeah, I do not want to see the Bible become even more of a rhetorical bludgeon and a weapon in the hands of folks who are using it for purposes that I would say are not good, but are phenomenally harmful, and particularly to the most vulnerable in our society.
Amazing. Thanks, Dan. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.